Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's program with the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society. We're going to give folks 1 or 2 extra minutes to get into the Zoom room before we start. So sit tight briefly and we'll get started in another 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Welcome again to today's Zoom program with the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society. We're going to give folks 1 more minute to find their way into the Zoom room, and then we'll get started in about another 60 seconds or so. Thanks for your patience. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome so much to today's program. My name is Joshua Furman. I'm the director of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society and affiliate faculty in the Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Denver. And I'm very happy to be with all of you and with our speaker, Dr. Britt Tevis. Today's topic, anti-Semitism in American history, is obviously one that grows ever more important and increasingly important for us to try to understand and come to grips with. And I think it's particularly helpful for us to look back at the long history of anti-Semitism in the United States. And that's why I'm so grateful that Professor Tevis is here with us today. So after I introduce our speaker, Dr. Tevis will present for about half an hour. Then I'll have some questions prepared for her. And then at the very end, we'll have time for questions from the audience. If you have a question for Professor Tevis, please do put it in the chat window. And when we get to the end of our program, we'll have time for hopefully several of those questions. Please also remember to stay muted throughout the duration of the program so that we can all hear and get the most out of our time with our speaker. So without further ado, Dr. Britt Tevis is the Phyllis Backer Assistant Professor in Jewish Studies in the Department of History at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Her work focuses on the intersection of Jews and American law. Her forthcoming volume, titled Sanctioned Bigotry, a documentary history of anti-Semitism in the United States, is a collection of 180 primary source documents spanning from 1654 to 2024, which illuminate different dimensions of anti-Jewish discrimination, violence, and bigotry in the United States. It will be published by Yale University Press in 2026. She earned her PhD and JD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Tevis, so glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank Dr. Furman and Ingrid for the invitation. And also, just on a personal note, I was just so thrilled and honored to be invited to speak with you today by Josh. I think we've known each other at this point 11 years, and I just personally think so incredibly highly of him, both because of his personal integrity, but also because of his personal intellectual generosity. And so, for that reason, I was especially excited to be invited. So, thank you so much for having me. And with that, I'm going to launch into my presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking about what we can learn about anti-Semitism in the United States by looking at archival materials, the documents that hold the secrets of the past and the documents used by historians to generate narratives about our history. And in many ways, you might be asking yourself, why why would we need to ask and answer such a simple question? Isn't this the basic stuff that historians do? Look at archival materials in order to understand the past. Um, hasn't this been done before? And the answer to that question is no. And in the context of the United States, that is to say, that anti-Semitism in the United States has been kind of painfully understudied, and there are reasons why that I'm would be happy to discuss during the Q&A. Um, so it is in fact important. It is necessary in order to understand anti-Semitism in the United States to look at archival materials, because what we have right now, what's missing from our understanding of the past, is we have instead definitions that are highly theoretical and reliant primarily on European historians' understandings of anti-Semitism. So, right now, if we look at kind of the main uh, sources and main figureheads and intellectuals who understand anti-Semitism in the United States and discuss it, people such as Deborah Lipstadt, to journalists such as Franklin Foer and Barry Weiss, to the head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt. These voices nearly uniformly define anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory. And that conspiracy theory is certainly important for understanding anti-Semitism, but in fact, it is insufficient. And we know that it's insufficient when we look at into archival materials and see different examples of manifestations of anti-Jewish bigotry and violence and discrimination in the United States. And so instead, today I want to propose what I think is a much more useful tool for understanding anti-Semitism in the United States. And when I say that it's a much more useful tool, I mean that for people who are engaged in this subject, for people who are informed citizens who need a kind of a simple intellectual rule of thumb for thinking about anti-Semitism, this is a way to avoid having to either flatten or simplify or ignore particular dimensions of anti-Semitism, which is required of us if we only understand anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory. So what is this definition that I've drawn from really 5 years of really intentional work looking at different archives in the United States? This definition requires us to understand anti-Semitism as a political program. It is a political program. And the purpose of that political program is to deny Jews rights, their legal rights, civil and political rights in the places where they live. In essence, to treat Jews as less than equal, as not deserving the same rights as others around them. Now, importantly, the intellectual underpinnings, the motivation for wanting to deny Jews political rights have been threefold in the United States. Number one has been Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism, and the desire to render the United States a Christian country, an exclusively Christian country. The second, indeed, has been conspiracy theory and the impulse to blame a certain phenomenon or event or episode on a perceived group of people who are in cahoots to make that episode happen. And the third element and third intellectual underpinning of this political program to deny Jews' rights has been racialism or scientific racism, this notion of Jewish biological distinctiveness. And I think most of us are probably quite familiar with this notion as it existed in the context of Nazi Germany, but are probably less familiar with the ubiquity of the notion of the Jewish race and the outcome of the racialization of Jews, which I should say persists through this very moment in both perverse and fascinating ways. So we're going to look at different archival examples of all of those three intellectual underpinnings of this political movement. But before we do, I want to just explain just a few reasons. I have many, but a few reasons why I think this is a useful definition. One of which is that often it's difficult to, and scholars certainly debate about this, it's often difficult to justify understanding the very different manifestations of anti-Jewish bigotry and violence unless we're looking at the common goal they share. And that's because, sometimes anti-Semitism appears in the form of vandalism and graffiti, and then sometimes it appears in the form of very violent mass murder, as in the case of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. And so, one thing that this definition allows us to do is to understand why it is, in fact, appropriate to lump together seemingly disparate examples of anti-Jewish bigotry without seeming as though we're categorizing too many dissimilar things in the same place. So, this allows manifestations of anti-Semitism ranging from rhetoric to violence to be grouped into the same category. It also is important, I think, in a useful definition because it allows us to shift away from the unstable arena of trying to figure out people's subjective intents. And it really eliminates the need to know individuals. Did they mean that salute? Did they mean that as a Nazi salute or not? That doesn't matter when we're looking and thinking about a political program designed to deny Jews' rights. And so by, I think, removing the role of the individual and looking at anti-Semitism systematically and as a larger problem with this definition, that is one of the merits of this definition. So I'm going to now move on to looking at these three intellectual underpinnings and how they've appeared in archival materials. And the first intellectual underpinning of this political program, as I mentioned, has been Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism, which has been an impulse and desire among a plurality, if not sometimes a majority, of the American population to merge church and state, and specifically when I say church, I mean the Christian church, into the legal system and into the law here in the United States. And this is an ongoing impulse that we can see persisting from the get-go, from really the start of the history of the United States. Here you're looking at we the people, the Bill of Rights, and the U.S. Constitution. And of course, one thing that was so wonderful and Jews celebrated with the ratification of the Constitution was the fact that it did not include test oaths requiring Jews to swear an allegiance to the Protestant Bible in order to hold office. And that's true at the federal level. There was no religious test included. And when the Bill of Rights came along, there was a promise of the freedom of religion. in the First Amendment. But that is not to say that there were no inequalities, legal inequalities imposed upon Jews um, uh, at the time of the American Revolution and in the post-revolutionary moment. There were in fact were many. Because if we look to the earliest state constitutions, and here we have an example from North Carolina, we can see that a majority of state constitutions, in fact, did include legal limitations on Jewish rights in those documents. So here we have the Constitution of North Carolina from 1776, and there's a clause that tells us that no person who shall deny the being of God or truth of the Protestant religion or the divine authority of either the Old or New Testaments, or who shall hold principles incompatible with the freedom and safety of the state, shall be capable of holding any public place, any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department within this state. In other words, if you did not comply with the requirement to take an oath on the Protestant Bible, you were ineligible for serving in public office. The most famous example of this kind of requirement was present in the Maryland Constitution. But it's important to note that 11 of the 13 original state constitutions included some sort of prohibition or legal limitation, which denied Jews rights, various rights, the rights to serve on juries, the rights to vote in some cases, the right to serve in the public militia, and the right to serve in public office. Now, sometimes people said to me, well, everyone, there are always mistakes in the past. That was the past. But there are two things to note, which is this kind of legal discrimination persisted beyond the Revolutionary period. What you're looking at here is yet another example of Christian supremacy fused into American law in the form of something called a Sunday closing law. This was a Sunday closing law which required that Jews, that every business owner shut their business on the Christian Sabbath. And this was particularly harmful for Jewish citizens. This came from the state of California. It was passed in 1859. This was particularly harmful for Jewish Californians, among whom were my ancestors, because it meant that for Jews who celebrate the Sabbath on Saturdays, they were unable to work 2 days of the week, and this was economically harmful, particularly for an immigrant population. Now, in some states, the passage of Christian Sabbath laws cannot be attributable to anti-Jewish animus. In some cases, we can look and see that the impulse to pass Christian Sabbath closing laws was in fact the desire to privilege Christianity, a true desire without animus towards Jews. In my opinion, I don't think that particularly matters because these laws did in fact harm Jews. In the case of California, unfortunately, this was not in fact, the passage of this law was not in fact without a desire to specifically harm Jews. In fact, the person who saw this law into fruition was a state congressman named William Stowe, featured here, who said on the state assembly floor, quote, "I have no sympathy with the Jews and would, were it in my power, enforce a regulation that would eliminate them not only from our county, but from the entire state. I am for a Jew tax that is so high that Jews would not be able to operate any more shops. The basis of Republican institutions is the Christian Sabbath and the Christian religion. The Jews must join the majority. They are a class of people who come here only to make money and who leave the country as soon as they have money. They do not invest any money, and they do not erect any of the beautiful houses that decorate our country." I should say that's my favorite line of this rant. There's something humorous about him taking issue with the aesthetic of Jewish homes. I hope someday to settle in their Jerusalem. The Bible is the basis of our institutions, and the lawmaking process must support its commandments. So again, this is Christian supremacy very intentionally operating and being used to discriminate against Jewish Californians. Again, this was the mid 19th century, and I should add that this impulse to fuse church and state, to fuse Christianity, persists actually through the present day, but also well into the 20th century. Here are just two examples of initiatives that really began in an organized way in 1874 after the Civil War, but to add a federal amendment to the United States Constitution, officially declaring the United States a Christian nation. Now, there have been hundreds and there are ongoing proposals to do this. Here are just two that I found in the materials in the National Archives. And you can see on the left, underlined, the language that's desired by these initiatives is we, the people of the United States, devoutly recognize the authority and law of Jesus Christ, the Savior and King of nations, and desiring to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and ensure domestic tranquility, etc., etc. There are many, many examples of this kind of uh, uh, impulse and in imposing inequality being justified and propelled by Christian supremacy. But I'm going to move on to conspiratorial thinking. Now, this is an element, a dimension of anti-Semitism that I think many people are at least somewhat familiar with. Most famously, the example of conspiratorial thinking and our ideas about anti-Semitism pertain to and originate from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a text originally produced in Russia and in the Russian language, which made its way to the United States around the time of World War I, and then was famously disseminated by the car magnate. Uh, I just uh, wrong car magnate. I'm thinking of the wrong car magnate. The car magnate Henry Ford, who included copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the Model Ts that he sold. And he bought a newspaper in Detroit, Michigan, where the Ford plant was, called the Dearborn Independent, Dearborn, Michigan, and the excerpts of the protocols of the Elders of Zion numbered around half a million at the height of its circulation. And so these are essays and articles. You can see from the title, The International Jew, The World's Problem. Many people are fairly familiar with this example. But this is not the only kind of anti-Jewish conspiracy theory that we can see as being hugely problematic and driving a desire to deny Jews rights in the United States. I want to look at this right here. These are examples from the National Archives of the ways in which the protocols were used by military intelligence officers during World War I to justify mass surveillance programs of Jews throughout the United States, regardless of those Jews' political views. So Jews that spanned the entirety of the political spectrum were being mass surveilled. There were mass surveillance programs, particularly in New York City, justified by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. On the left, you see a note from a colonel. Have you ever read these documents, the Jewish protocols? But I want to move past this very well-known example to look at a more recent example of anti-Jewish conspiracy theory. And from the archives, this is a copy of an image that was in a um, right-wing mailer. And what you're looking at is, I'm going to read this to you. It's from the late 1980s. It says, I am Faye Waddleton, president of Planned Parenthood. We kill and murder unborn babies for high profits and black power. Jew doctors are the high priests of blood and slaughter. Freemason Supreme Court justices illegally forced Roe Wade on a gullible public. We lust and murder for greed. Your unborn baby could be next. For those of you who don't know, Faye Waddleton was the first African American president of Planned Parenthood, which is a women's health organization that famously offers family planning services, as well as an abortion providing institution. And what this is an example of is a few things. Number one, the impulse among many white nationalists to pair Jews and African Americans as being in cahoots with one another to harm white Americans. So here we're seeing that Jew doctors are conspiring with Faye Waddleton and the members of Planned Parenthood to slaughter the unborn. It's also an example of the rise, really, of Holocaust denial in the post-World War II moment, because a lot of this literature also conveys the idea that there's a real Holocaust. The real Holocaust is not what you think it is. It's not, the real Holocaust wasn't perpetuated against Jews abroad. It's actually happening here in the United States, and it's happening to white Americans. And it's being actually perpetuated, ironically, by Jew doctors who are in cahoots with, there's always a secondary group. One group that's frequently slotted in are African Americans. I've also seen very specifically lesbian nurses as being as conspiring with the Jewish doctors uh, in their quest to supposedly commit an anti-white genocide. And the third element, besides this very long-standing notion of a Black Jewish conspiracy, besides Holocaust denial, the third dimension of this conspiracy that you're looking at is of echoes accusations of blood libel, and the notion that Jews are uh, kill Christian babies, which dates back to the Middle Ages. Now, uh, the late 1980s, not that long ago, but lest you think this is only an example from the past, you should know that in as recently as 2022, a state assemblyman in Kentucky by the name of Danny Bentley gave a speech on the floor of the Kentucky State Assembly against the legality of RU 486, which is better known, commonly known as the abortion pill. And he blamed a Jewish woman for inventing that pill. And again, and it was suggesting his speech that Jews were invested in both an abortion and annihilating the white race. And this leads me to uh, here's a third example. Beyond this example about abortion, the notion that Jews are intervening in American elections. Here we can see this is from Kevin McCarthy, the former Speaker of the House, who's blaming George Soros and other Jews. George Soros has become something of the new Rothschild for supposedly buying the elections. The third, and I think most unappreciated example, and the third intellectual underpinning of this broader political effort to deny Jews' rights is scientific racism or racialism and the understanding of Jews as biologically distinct. What you're looking at here is a postcard from 1879, and many of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with the imagery that you're looking at, which is a very common, both in Europe and the United States, a very common late 19th century depiction of Jews as having a very specific set of physical characteristics. These include, of course, the oversized nose, the dark, curly, or kinky hair, these very full, round, exaggerated lips. And I'm hoping the colors properly conveyed here, but you can note here that the skin of these individuals is not white. It's actually swarthy and dark and shaded. It's not black, but it's also not a pure white. You can see here that all three members of this family, their faces are virtually identical. And what that's meant to convey to the person looking at this postcard is that Jews don't change. Jews are biologically identical and they will never change. We understand that because we see the parents and the son who look absolutely identical. This is an image that was produced in 1879 after an episode uh, that took place in Manhattan Beach in New York, in which the owner of a hotel, the Manhattan Beach Hotel, named Austin Corbin, who owned both a railroad and this hotel, barred Jews publicly both from being at the hotel and using his rail line. This happened in the aftermath of a better-known event called the Seligman Affair in 1877, when another Jew was barred from a different hotel. And that's what you're looking at here. This is also a depiction of that same event. And again, we're seeing Jewish racialization in this image. This is from Puck magazine, which was a popular magazine that circulated and frequently circulated anti-immigrant imagery, including anti-Semitic imagery. But again, you're seeing Jewish racialization. And the image that you're seeing here that's titled Hints for the Jews, Several Ways of Getting to Manhattan Beach. And Jews are supposedly changing their exteriors in order to try to sneak into Manhattan Beach. So in the very back, you see the image of a man who's having his nose cut off. And then you also see here another man who's hanging by his hair. He's straightening his hair. And then finally, you see Jews who are, you see the little image of a menu, Jews who are apparently willing to ingest sausage and it says and pig, and they're eating non-kosher food as a way supposedly to pass. And we know they're passing because if we look to the text in the left-hand corner of this Jewish married couple, it says Corbin's white Jews and whiter Jewess. So again, the fact that this is in quotations is a nod to the viewer to imply, to tell the viewer they in fact are not white. We also know that Jews are not white based on the depictions of them at the forefront of this image. In the left-hand corner, you see a Jewish man dressed in normatively in a woman's outfit and a Jewish woman dressed in a man's outfit. This was also speaking to the racialization of Jews and the ways that Jewish women were hyper masculine, supposedly, and Jewish men were hyper feminine. The musical instruments are commentary on Jewish supposed volume and basically loudness and how obnoxious they are. So this is again an imagery of Jewish racialization. Now, you may say to yourself, well, that's fine. That's in the cultural sphere. That's not the law. But in fact, in the same moment, we see Jewish racialization in taking place within the legal system. Just one more example, because it's one of my favorites. This is a book published in 1888. And in this book, the original Mr. Jacobs, A Startling Expose, this book included the page to the left, which is a diagram for readers, which is supposedly enables readers to spot Jews among them. Because one of Jews' distinctive racial traits, supposedly, was the capacity to fit in, to blend in easily. And you wouldn't want Jews to do that. And so you needed this helpful guide for how to spot them. And of course, these were the stereotypical traits physically associated with Jews. So these images soon make their way into the legal system and into the ways in which Jews encounter the state. What you're looking at here from 1891 is a wanted bulletin produced by the Chicago Police Department in the late 19th century, looking for a supposed Jewish criminal. And here, this man pictured is described as having a slim built, black hair, sallow complexion. Again, sallow does not mean light. This man is not being perceived as white, he's being perceived as dark. Dark brown eyes, a long, thin, drooping back mustache, short side whiskers, and a Hebrew nose and features. So again, Jewish racialization is being merged with the operation of police detective work in Chicago. These are images that are used. What you're looking here is phrenology and the notion that one can determine somebody's race as well as their intentions and their ethics based on their skulls. And these two people are Leopold and Loeb, teenagers who were put on trial in Chicago in the early 20th century for supposedly murdering a younger teenager. These are Jewish men who are found guilty of murder. But again, if we read the trial transcript and the prosecution's case against these two men, it's just dripping in this racialized understanding of who Jews are and Jews' capacity for ethics and really their lack of capacity for ethical behavior, and attributed their supposed murder to their Jewishness. One of the most important and most damaging uses of racialization to further the political aim of Jewish inequality appeared in the Dillingham Commission. And this will be my final example, the Dillingham Commission, which is the very, very large study produced by the United States Congress in 1911, which was the underlying logic behind the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which substantially limited the number of immigrants eligible for entry to the United States based on a quota system, a racialized quota system using the 1890 census. But when we look at Jews in the Dillingham Commission, the Dillingham Commission racialized Jews, understanding them as Hebrews, and had lengthy discussions, in fact, about why it was proper to understand Jews as a racialized group of people. And this language appears in support of limiting Jewish immigration to the United States for pretty much the remainder of the 20th, well, at least to the 1960s. I'm going to give you just one example. Here's language from the 1921 emergency quota law. This was from a House report justifying why it was needed to pass this 1921 emergency quota law, which again was offered the basic structure of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. So I'm going to read this. The bulk of immigrants to the United States from this district, and the district being the Russian Caucasus, are highly undesirable as material for future citizens. They are not only illiterate, but the years of unsettled conditions in which they have been forced to live have caused them to lose the habit of work. Their physical and moral courage is greatly depleted, as well as their physical constitutions. The bulk of them have been habituated either to lawlessness or to the exercise of violence in the name of the law for so long that if not actually impregnated with Bolshevism, they are good material for Bolshevik propaganda. Our restrictions on immigration should be so rigid that it would be impossible for most of these people to enter the United States. Reference is especially made to Armenians, Jews, Persians, and Russians of the ordinary classes, all of which have been driven hither and thither since 1914, that they cannot be regarded as desirable populations for any country. There are, of course, many individual exceptions. So again, this racialized understanding of Jews has driven the impulse to impose an inequality, limiting Jews' civil and political rights in the United States. And for these reasons, I think it is really incumbent upon us, for those of us who are interested and invested in understanding anti-Semitism in the United States to really take a much more mature, historically complete uh, understanding of what anti-Semitism is in order to be able to both identify its manifestations today and understand it in the past. So I thank you again for having me. I'm going to stop now, and I really look forward to a discussion with all of you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Go ahead if you haven't already. If you have a question for Dr. Tevis, please do put it in the chat window. I see one or two are waiting for us there already. For the benefit of people who maybe joined the meeting a few minutes late, let me start by asking you to reiterate what I think is your key essential point. And that is this: how does thinking about anti-Semitism as a civil rights issue and a legal problem rather than just an issue of prejudicial or religious or racist dislike of Jewish people change the way that we understand anti-Semitism and maybe also the way that we should seek to remedy it?
I think a few things. Number one, thank you for that question. So number one, the first, I think one of the first, and this is less of a problem now than it was when I started my research, but the first issue I think is actually taking anti-Semitism in the United States, and the key phrase here, in the United States, seriously, it's been a long-standing problem both among scholars of American Jewish history and among scholars of American history, generally speaking, and then among the broader public. So number one, I think it's incumbent upon us to actually say, you know what? Anti-Semitism in the United States is not a one-off. Every one of these episodes is not an exception to the rule, but actually, we can look and identify patterns here. And it's important for us to do that so that, hopefully that we can think about, and this is beyond what I do as a historian, but hopefully people who devise policies can think about ways to minimize the ill effects and to address the problem. So understanding there are patterns that can be identified and there are merit actually studying. I will say again, that was more of a problem when I started this research than it is now. That's not a good thing, in my opinion, but that's less of a problem. The second reason why I think it's necessary to do the work of looking to the archives is both because there really is a fundamental misunderstanding of precisely what anti-Semitism is, and there is a need for us to actually draw borders around what it is and what it isn't. Every bad thing that happens to a Jew cannot be called anti-Semitism, or because then nothing's anti-Semitism. So it's important to generate boundaries. And this is a definition, and looking to the archives allows us to generate those boundaries and allows us to think about, well, what actually does constitute and does not constitute anti-Semitism. And so seeing patterns through this definition beyond just conspiracy theory and looking at both the ways that racialization has been a key element in anti-Semitism and also Christian supremacy has been a key element in anti-Semitism, in addition to conspiratorial thinking, is a way for us to have a fuller picture of what has gone on here in the United States. So that's at least one of the major, I think, benefits to understand anti-Semitism this way. I'll add one more, which I didn't bring up earlier, which I'm particularly proud of, which is, I often hear anti-Semitism thought about as something that's harmful to Jews and exclusively Jews. But that's also not the case. Anti-Semitism is harmful to non-Jews as well, and that also ought to be understood. And here I'll just give you an example of how. A, um, non-Jews are often mistaken for Jews, right? Gentleman's agreement is the perfect, right? Number one. But also for people who are emotionally and socially and committed and involved with Jews personally, it also harms them. I'm thinking of a number of lawsuits by housing associations that are waged in the 50s and 60s against, despite the fact that residential covenants are no longer allowed. You can't put in a housing deed anymore that Jews aren't allowed. Still, housing associations which barred Jews from living in certain neighborhoods, non-Jewish spouses were targeted as violating them. So non-Jewish spouses were sued, saying you have a Jewish spouse. Jews aren't allowed to live in these neighborhoods. We're suing you, the non-Jewish spouse, for breaching this contractual obligation. So this allows for a more expansive understanding of anti-Semitism as only harming Jews and actually being really a harm to democracy, which in addition to harming Jews, it also is antithetical to those kind of political and philosophical commitments.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you for that. You talked a lot about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism within a Christian nationalist framework, which we typically associate, of course, with, politics on the right to the far right end of the spectrum. I think since October 7th, a lot of us, maybe whose politics are more centrist or leftist, have been maybe surprised or shocked to find that many progressive spaces have revealed themselves to be um, venues in which the same kind of exclusionary or essentialist approach to Jews and Jewish identity, unfortunately, is being discovered. And I wonder if, in the course of your research or how you think about anti-Semitism, has that surprised you? Have you seen other historical examples of that in more leftist political spaces?
Excellent question. And I too, I share the conclusion that you just drew. It pains me to, I mean, it's not a happy conclusion by any means. And I think that one way that understanding how racialization has operated is useful to us is actually understanding anti-Semitism on the left in this moment. And what I mean specifically is that, well, historically speaking, and when we look to, for example, to the early 20th century, Jews are being racialized as non-white for the purpose of denying Jews' rights, right? Jews are being racialized as non-white to justify anti-Jewish segregation. At the end of the 20th century and in the start of the 21st century, in this moment, we're also seeing Jews racialized for the purpose of distinguishing them and the purpose of denying access, denying inclusion. Except Jews aren't being racialized as not, they're being racialized as non-white on the right. On the left, what we're seeing is Jewish racialization as white, and that whiteness is justification for exclusion from certain spaces. So, by way of example, um, at a particular New York university last year, there was an email sent by the president of a school club saying white Zionists, excuse me, white Zionists are not permitted to come to our school event. Because and the email continued on emphasizing the whiteness of the descendants of Holocaust survivors, etc. So the whiteness and the racialization of the Jew as white within spaces on the left is put forth as evidence of supposed Jewish culpability or guilt, particularly as it pertains to Israel. And so again, understanding that Jewish racialization has been an underlying factor, an intellectual underpinning of anti-Jewish discrimination helps us understand and helps us understand how, in some cases, not in all cases, not in all cases, in some cases, when anti-Zionism in fact does bleed into anti-Semitism. Knowing that racialization element, right? Knowing, okay, well, that may be something that is something we need to be very, if we hear this whiteness is never made as a neutral, because racialization is never a neutral judgment. So right, this whiteness always comes with you've done something wrong. And so that's something to look out for. And that is a way in which figuring that out was indeed surprising to me, in short.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. All right. We have some questions in the chat from our audience, so we'll take a few of those now. Brian Field asks this: the examples of anti-Semitism from Christian supremacy and from racialization that were shown seem to be generations old. and the conspiracy examples seem to be more contemporary. Are there more contemporary examples of anti-Semitism from Christian supremacy and racialization? Is this a phenomenon that you see as ongoing?
So it absolutely is a phenomenon that I see as ongoing. And I'll just give a few examples. As far as Christian supremacy, right now there are a number of states that grant private institutions the right to deny Jewish families the right to adopt children because of their Jewishness. Right? Jewish uh, people who want to be adoptive parents have been denied the right to adopt based on their Jewish identities by these institutions, which are private institutions empowered by the state to oversee adoption. So, and the reason being that Jews can't be trusted to raise Christians, right? We want, and we, and the implication is we want Christian citizens.
Hmm.
So that is one with an ongoing, that's an issue that's currently being litigated. Here are others ways in which Christian supremacy is operating. There are a number of states that have caucuses on Saturday, and despite the persistent challenges and efforts to not have caucuses on Saturday so that Jews who celebrate Shabbat on Saturday may participate, there's been no remedy. This is not true in federal prisons, but many state prisons deny prisoners access to kosher food, deny prisoners access to Jewish Bibles. And so there are states that are trying to reimpose mandatory reading of Christian Bibles. So this isn't by no means. I'm a historian, so of course I'm going to go. I like the old examples. I like really old, yellow tinged paper. The stuff that's newer, I'm like, oh, that's so contemporary. But so yes, my examples definitely skew towards the past. I'm guilty of that, but by no means do I mean to suggest that this is a phenomenon that we can only look to the past to understand. I'm just trying to say it's also back there. This is not new. And again, as far as racialization, this is what's so interesting. On the one hand, the Charlottesville marchers, right? Jews will not replace us. And the Proud Boys, that whole crew certainly subscribe to Jewish racial distinctiveness and continue to see Jews not as white, but as racially distinct in a Nazi kind of way. And at the same time, on the left, Jewish racialization takes this form of Jewish whiteness, and therefore the implications are culpability in whatever kind of political movement that group has identified as problematic.
Right, right. Okay, we have a few more questions. Um, uh, Cynthia Gensheimer asks, does social exclusion, such as by fraternities, meet your definition of anti-Semitism?
I mean, why are we excluding, when you say social exclusion, is a fraternity excluding Jews because they are Jewish? Then I would say yes, insofar as fraternities are formal, in the same way when professional organizations exclude Jews historically because of their Jewishness, that constitutes anti-Semitism to me because that's an inequality premised on Jewish identity.
Hmm.
Um, and particularly insofar as I mean, it depends very much on the specifics of the institutions involved. But university funded or university associated clubs and affiliations certainly are part of larger systems that um, I don't think there should be a right basically to impose racial or religious or ethnic forms of discrimination.
Sure. Yeah. Alexandra says, thanks for the informative talk. And her question is, how should someone go about talking about anti-Semitism to someone who doesn't think it's as important to address as other prejudices?
Well, that's a really great question. And that's a hard question. You know, uh, On the one hand, I would say um, uh, there are some people that we'll encounter, right, who have no interest in learning. But I'm going to presume that the person you're encountering is invested in you and is open-minded enough to actually hear you out. So there are a few things. I think I would ask why Jews why Jews do not merit equality. Why attention to examples of Jewish inequality don't merit our attention. Um, uh, I think what you're pointing to is a real phenomenon. By way of example, I know DEI is no longer permissible, and these programs are probably going to be disappearing at some point. But the persistent desire to deny Jews or Jewish involvement in DEI programs, for example, I think that's a similar impulse. This idea that like somehow anti-Semitism is not a real problem. We don't really need to discuss it. And I often like to ask people, why not? Does somehow identifying or talking about anti-Semitism deny the persistence of anti-Black racism, for example? Of course not. Of course it doesn't. The other thing I think is useful is looking at the ways in which, anti-Asian exclusion, anti-Black exclusion, anti-Black racism overlaps with anti-Semitism. I frequently like to tell my students that white supremacists are not a creative, they're not a creative group of people. So if they're going to find a way to discriminate against one group, they're going to redeploy it again and again and again. And so we can actually see a lot of similarities in the ways in which Jews have been treated, which is not to say identically. I'm saying there are similarities that we can identify in the histories of Black Americans and Jewish Americans, for example. So I think maybe looking at overlaps is another useful a path into to encouraging people to think about anti-Semitism.
I always enjoy this question to colleagues. How did you get into anti-Semitism research? Can you kind of take us through your professional path? I know that you've been interested for a long time in the intersection of Jewish life and American law, and you've published some really wonderful and award-winning articles, let me say. But how did you kind of take us through your journey as a scholar to finding this topic?
Josh, I asked myself that same question. Um, uh, uh, so I should say that it in many ways it was quite accidental. As you said, I've had a long, my initial scholarly interest and it maintains my interest is really looking at the intersection of Jewish history and legal history. I couldn't have told you when I started graduate school. Like, I didn't understand this about myself, but I know now that what I was really interested in was and really could not comprehend was power. I wanted to know about how does power work? Like I it just was such a mystery to me. So that's what really drove me to really try to understand and study legal history. And I was very interested in Jewish history. And when you spend enough time studying Jews and law, I started seeing not one example, not two examples. I started, having, there's so many examples of the ways in which Jews have been treated differently because of their Jewishness when they've engaged with the American legal system. And so for a while, I was like, I was like, I actually genuinely was like, what is this? What would we call this inequality? What's happening? That's when I realized, this is it. This is anti-Semitism. They are targeted as Jews. These individuals are targeted as Jews, and suffer, unfairly by being excluded and denied admissions into the United States. We're thinking about immigration or excluded from universities, excluded from certain suburbs and housing, ineligible for certain jobs. So I backed my way into it, and here I am.
All right. Well, we'll end with this question. I remember when I was a college student myself and going into graduate school around 2004, which was a big anniversary from 1654, right? And thinking about, the role that the United States has played in Jewish history and the question of whether or not America has been an exceptional home and refuge for Jews in the United States. And I think if you had asked most people that question a few years ago, maybe we would have more enthusiastically said, oh, without question, Jews in the United States have enjoyed relatively unparalleled civil rights, access to educational opportunities, access to socioeconomic mobility, access to a kind of life that, Jews coming from other parts of the world could only have dreamed of, right, a few centuries ago. And yet here we are today in 2025, and you've shown us, as other scholars have also shown us, that anti-Semitism actually, in fact, does have a long and documented history in the United States. So how does this research, help us think about this question about American exceptionalism and American Jewish history in maybe a new or a more complex light?
Well, just certainly for those of us who love historiography, as I do as a historian, and as you do as a historian, that's the right question to be asking. Thinking about, has this major framework that we've all been deploying and thinking about American Jewish history, does it really hold up? And perhaps it's obvious, but to my mind, the answer is no. And or if yes, we really need to nuance our when and where. We can't think of America as a place where there's, just a success story. It's just a rags to riches story. It's the place where all American Jews got to be Cinderella. It has not been, that has not been the case. And so if and when we do deploy an exceptionalist framework, an exceptionalist narrative, and an understanding of America as different and distinct from everywhere else, we need to be very, very specific about it because I don't think as a major framework that it is a useful tool for us to understand the history of American Jews. And that's really the heart within at least the scholarly circles, that's like kind of the heart. Is this narrative useful for us anymore?
Yeah, that's great. All right, we'll get ready to end it there. Thank you again to Dr. Britt Tevis, Syracuse University, for joining us today and sharing your expertise and insights into the issue and problem of anti-Semitism in American history. I want to let everybody know about a really exciting upcoming program that we have with the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society. On Tuesday, April 1st, at the Wolf Theater here in Denver at the Denver JCC, we are bringing Galit and Danielle Dardashti, creators of the podcast The Nightingale of Iran, and they will be sharing the story of their family, an Iranian Jewish musical family that, of course, was made to flee Iran and ended up in the United States. And that will be on Tuesday, April 1st. We hope you'll join us for that. And thank you all again for coming. And thank you again to Dr. Tevis and to my colleague Ingrid Wire, our program manager at the Center for Judaic Studies, for outstanding support as always. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you at another program soon.